And what I'd like to tack on, in a sense, is a sort of brief continuation, focusing on sort of the underclass, particularly in urban areas, and just to make some comments about life in the city in the late 19th century. And to do that, I've always sort of thought about New York City as the premier point of departure. Chicago has got some good characteristics we might use as well. But when I think of New York, I tend to want to think of summertime. There was a growing population, high temperatures, because as you know, New York City can get very, very warm in the summer. But growing population, so you have more and more people packed into the space of, say, a Manhattan. And space being at a premium, these folks often being poor, not having the resources to afford better, they are forced into apartments that were never intended to house the numbers, multiple families, for instance, that ultimately end up living in these apartments. One of the terms you'll often hear used is that of the tenement. It was not uncommon in your larger cities for whole families to share space that was intended for one family with 2 or 3 families, all bringing in money necessary to pay what were often exorbitant rents, just so that they could have housing. Now, just because they paid rent didn't mean that the conditions of their housing or of the tenements was good in any way. Often they lacked indoor plumbing. You didn't have heating and cooling. We're very lucky in some regards now to have heat pumps and air conditioning and the things we've come to depend on. But you're talking here about coal-burning stoves for warmth, so that in wintertime in New York City, for instance, or Chicago, it could be very, very cold, just as in summer it could be very warm. Well, in summer, when it comes to cooling down, what are your options? Among other things, you open a window, if that's even possible. And I like to think then about what level of stench would have been around. And I know that may seem a little gross, but you think about it, it's a good time for like a scratch and sniff book, if you've ever seen one of those. It's one of those children's books, where you turn the page and then you've got this material that has a certain aroma to it. When you scratch it, that aroma is released. I just thinking of it in sort of an olfactory sense. Can you imagine summertime in New York in the late 19th century? I mean, just consider. You don't have proper disposal of waste, and that includes human waste and garbage. So there's this constant smell. You don't have access to, nor would you necessarily want to, bathe particularly regularly. You might sometimes. It just wasn't done as much as it tends to be now in the United States. So you have the smells of bodily odors. Don't have a lot of toothbrushing going on. There's just a lot of smells like that. But then you add to it what's happening in the street. Again, you've got rotting materials, vegetables and fruits and meat. And then you've got thousands upon thousands of horses, of livestock who are moving goods and people about the city. And when you have livestock, you have manure. That's being produced. And by the ton, it becomes this huge issue, which we'll talk about later. It's going to play in later. A huge issue, for instance, in New York, as to how to deal with the issues of hygiene, the questions of hygiene within the city. The city's not just a space. It's not just a number of people. It is that place where issues are often worked out, because it's there in the city that the issues are most defined because of the compression that occurs, but population, the numbers, the pressures. New York will have to deal with it. Chicago will have to deal with it. And skipping away from New York for just a moment, consider Chicago, stockyard to the world. Consider the amount of beef and hogs that are processed in Chicago. You have the lumber industry. You have manufacturing going on there that produces coal smoke, much as you do in New York. It's a jumble of tenements and blocks in which you have housing, residential, multiple families, people packed in. You have manufacturing going on nearby. It's not like we often see today where you have areas zoned for industry and areas zoned for residential. Instead, you still have more of a hodgepodge, more of a mixture in these cities. In many towns, it was uncommon for the main roads, or much more than the main roads, to even be paved, so there were constant issues of mud. If you did raise your window, you caught the stench during the summers from the smell, the stench from the heat that's produced by the heat of summer on all those smells we talked about. It's not exactly what you might call fresh air, but then you add to that the ash and the coal smoke that's produced at the factories as they're running, and the fact they're all mixed in with residential. Again, it seems like a great idea for a scratch and sniff book for children. Perhaps they would like it. But this too is part of the story of the underclass. Is it entirely new, this sort of life that people are living? Well, no, not really. There are elements of the farm, the smells of the farm. It's not all daisies and meadows out there. But at the same time, I think it's really a matter of degree. It's a matter of the compression of people and these issues of hygiene and disposal, issues of daily life that, first of all, become tied to ideas about poverty, about these immigrants, about who they are. The assumption that middle and upper class Americans often made, looking back at the neighborhoods they had abandoned, neighborhoods that had often fallen into disrepair, buildings that landlords had allowed to fall into disrepair. And they reached, I think, the improper conclusions that just because certain people had come from particular areas, or they were of one or another ethnic origins, that the circumstances in which they lived reflected that culture. Not always the case. Not always the case at all. But it's something that we'll talk more about as we move through American history.